Hello again, glad to see you once more. Sit back and relax for the third installment of the Arcounter Devlog series. This month we will be focusing on the beginnings of the first environment tile set. Join me and I will show you how I turn this into this. Now that we have the combat functional, it was high time to move on from the test level onto something more substantial. The first priority was to get the level generation up and running. The main inspiration I had in mind while designing it was Spelunky. Yeah, Spelunky. How it starts is quite simple. First, a grid of a given size is generated. Let's just say a 10x10 grid for now. Each with their x horizontal and y vertical coordinates. Then we will have to get a starting point. We will start smack dab in the middle of the first row, the 5-0 square. This square is added to the list of the main path tiles. Then the algorithm picks a direction at random and checks whether the tile in that direction already belongs to the main path. If it does, the algorithm tries again. If all of the surrounding tiles are already taken, the main path list is cleared and the algorithm is restarted. This goes on until a tile in the last row is reached. Then I can apply some additional checks. For example, as of right now, I do not want for the main path of the level to consist of more than 20 rooms. If that is the case, you guessed it, the main path list is cleared and the algorithm is restarted. With a few tries of that, a viable path is eventually generated. Now, this is where the fun starts. Time to place the actual room models along the path. Let me introduce the room database. A list which keeps track of available rooms. Currently there are 3 rooms to choose from. The starting and ending rooms are used for just that. They always get placed as the first and last rooms on the main path. And then we have the helpfully named Room 1 and Room 2. Thanks, Past Greg. The difference between them is mostly based on the different number of exits. Room 1 has 4, while Room 2 only has 2. Currently there is no graphic indication of that, but it works for the testing purposes. Going back to the room placement, for each square on the path that is neither first nor last, a following set of instructions happen. A random room from the available rooms list is chosen. It is then placed in a random Y rotation in 90-degree increments. At that moment, the algorithm checks whether its exits are compatible with where the previous and the next rooms are in relationship to it. Should it be incompatible, it will then be rotated 90 degrees clockwise and checked again. After 3 of these turns, if the room is still incompatible, a different random room is chosen, and the matching process begins anew. This happens until a suitable room with the correct rotation is found, and since one of the rooms has 4 exits, that is always bound to happen. Thus far, only 2 exits per room are considered, so let us just say 4 rooms in a 2x2 grid were chosen. While technically each room could potentially have 3 exits opened, only 2 will be for each one. Then comes the height of the room. Heights of the previous exit and current entrance are compared, and each subsequent room is placed at a height that allows you to traverse between them without slamming into the walls. Then comes the nav mesh generation. For most of the movement, enemies traverse by simply trying to follow the player while avoiding other enemies. Though where that would be difficult, like for example when they cannot see the player or where there is a vertical distance to navigate, they use the good old Unity nav mesh system. The implementation is still a work in progress. Finally comes marking which doors should be open. This will be helpful in the future, and presto! The level generation is done. With that done, it was time to make the rooms a bit more appealing. And oh boy was that a challenge. I have never really made a game environment before this, so from the start I knew there would be a lot to learn. I started by creating the basic layout of the room and adding some VFX. I really wanted to try my hand at creating the water fountains for this place. It felt like they would bring a calming atmosphere to the area, showing that some things still remain intact, even after whoever knows how long this place has been abandoned for. I began by modeling the rough shape I wanted. Then came the water itself, the cool part of this whole operation. I modeled a rough shape and then smooth subdivided it once. Afterwards, I started experimenting with the UVs. I knew I wanted to have a single scrolling texture going through the whole model to create the illusion of flowing water. A pretty standard technique for waterfalls, rivers and such. Unwrapping the cylindrical stream did not pose too much of an issue. Unwrapping the water surface though, that was a real challenge. A challenge big enough that I realized it would be easier to unwrap it first and model later. And that's just what I did. After connecting the two and testing how they look like, I moved into creating a shader in Unity's shader graph. Ta-da! A simple human readable graph. Now, just add some VFX to simulate foam, and that part is finished. Next came making the model of the actual fountain itself. My approach was very close to how I made the spear demon last month. Making a simple base mesh, sculpting in the details and dents, retopologizing, unwrapping, and finally some texturing for the finish. Once I finished everything and saw the model in engine, I realized two things. The model looked quite bare at this point, so I quickly made some bronze bracings and put them in engine as well, with the basic material to see how it would look finished. Much better. And secondly, God, did this take a long time for a single asset. Change of plans, implying there was some kind of plan in the first place. Let us switch to a less time-consuming method. I am unsure of how it is called. I have seen it referred to as OnetoOne Modeling in a tweet that should have subtweeted me, but okay. It consists exactly of what you think it would. You model something, unwrap it, throw it into the engine. Sure, you will end up with way more triangles with things like bevels, but it's way quicker. It also reduces the number of textures that need to be loaded in the memory, since models can share materials instead of having custom ones made for each model. And so, I got to work. Created a couple dozen models, placed them in the room and felt the scene come much more to life. There's this indescribable feeling that I get every now and then whenever I implement on something and bring in some models. The feeling of, wow, this is starting to look more and more like an actual game rather than a small project I'm just doing for fun. But enough reminiscing, there is still plenty of work to be done, let's get back on track. Another issue with this type of asset creation, as you might have guessed, since we are reusing materials, things get to look a bit samey. One of the techniques you can use to break this monotony is vertex painting. Each 3D model file contains a list of vertices, and each vertex is packed with useful info. Every vertex contains its position, the way it is pointing or its normal, and its UV coordinates, to name but a few. The one we are interested in is its color though. That's right, they all contain an RGBA value, and the workflows that include changing or using that value are commonly referred to as vertex painting. On its own, it does not look very good, unless you have a ridiculous amount of verts, but it's still useful data we can modify to our liking. For example, we can use the various channels as masks. Show something here, hide something there. And that is just what I used it for. This is how the simplest vertex blended material looks like. The leaves show up where the color red has been painted. It does not look right though. Sure, the extremes look fine. There are definitely leaves on one side and definitely not on the other. The issue starts to arise in the middle, where it's not quite leaves, not quite not leaves. It looks muddy and not very believable. To solve that issue, we use the height blend stone to evolve our vertex painting into height blended vertex painting. Instead of just relying on our vertex paint to control the blending of materials, we can add a height map into the mix. Since a height map consists only of a grayscale image, I put it into the alpha channel of the color texture to reduce the amount of textures that need to be loaded. We add the alpha to the vertex paint, subtract a value which will dictate how much a certain texture will cover the ones beneath, put a hard curve on the mask, and presto, a nice looking blend between the two textures. Did that for the whole texture set and went off to paint the scene with vegetation and such. Adding some leaf meshes helped the definition and dimensionality of what I was going for. I realized that traversing cleared rooms might be tedious though, so to alleviate that and make future testing easier for myself, I created a new traversal method. If you hold shift for 3 seconds, you switch to the hovering mode of travel. This was done deliberately, so you cannot really use it in combat. In this mode, you're unable to cast spells or war run, but your movement speed is significantly increased and you can hover over small obstacles you have to jump over with regular movement. After you've started it though, you can switch back at the click of a button or whenever you get damaged. Now for some of the actual gameplay that happens in the rooms. I have set up a trigger zone that begins the encounter whenever you enter a room. As soon as you enter, if the room has not been cleared before, all of the doors shut until you defeat all of the enemies in the room. After you do that, entrances which were open before finally comes marking which doors should be open. This will be helpful in the future. Open again. Additionally, whenever you enter a room, the level manager gets alerted of that. This helps immensely with the optimization of the game, because each time this happens, two things take place. Rooms which are one room away from the room you have entered have all of their assets shown, and a room twice that distance from the chain have their assets hidden. This helps ensure that at no point more than 3 rooms have their assets displayed. And now they all came together, it was time for some balancing changes. In my personal opinion, combat was quite difficult and unforgiving as of the time of the last devlog. Combos were hard to pull off, unlike getting hit. I took several steps to address this problem. First one was improving the clarity of the combat. Now all the things that will damage you have a bright red outline if coming into contact with them would deal damage to the player. While looking very gamey, it definitely bettered the overall experience. Melee enemies turned out to be way too aggressive as well. They did keep you on your toes though. However fun attempting to jump on the same frame you hit the ground is, I thought not everyone might enjoy this level of space mashing. So now melee enemies have a little wind up animation before they charge at you, and the charge is way longer and slower. Finally, you can recognize whether an enemy is in melee or ranged mode by what they have on their back. Throwing demons will have a bunch of spears on the back, while melee enemies do not have anything. After those changes, the gameplay was definitely better, but I felt like something was still lacking. There were too many stops in the gameplay. It did not really have a flow state, and it felt like I was waiting for cooldowns every time I cast a spell. And who would come to the rescue? YouTube comments. I would really like to thank Sammy for this suggestion under my previous devlog. Indeed, having 2 spells that you can plan out for your next step made the game way more enjoyable. And that is the batch of changes for this month. On that note, I would like to encourage you to comment if you have any questions or suggestions that you think will help the development. Subscribe to get updates, like to help me beat the algorithm, and thank you for sticking with me for this long. Tune in next month for stuff you might be doing in between the runs. NPC interactions. Is that a trade?